Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to, on behalf of ISCMP, welcome to this webinar. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists for you today and a very busy agenda. In the last 12 months, we've actually seen some phenomenal actions in getting both vaccines and medicines through development and manufacturing and through regulatory approval, making them available for patients in record time. And today, I really want us to understand how we can learn from this and build it into the way that we work going forwards. I think it's been an outstanding achievement. I do hope, as the slide says here, that 2021 will be the year of continuous manufacturing. I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to go after, some largely unexplored, such as how we can use continuous manufacturing in mRNA vaccine manufacture, for example. Others in small molecules, and how we can use continuous manufacturing as an opportunity to reshore some generic products, creating high-value pharma manufacturing jobs and ensuring resilience in the generic supply chain. And we already see that happening in quite a number of Western countries. We need to look beyond quality and productivity gains when we're thinking about new technologies and look at some of the other benefits that we get. Benefits like process agility, with products produced in 2 months instead of the standard 20 months or so that it takes at the moment, and the ability to switch very simply between molecules in that manufacturing kit. The opportunity that comes with scalability issues largely being removed in continuous manufacturing. And also in the year of COP25 in Glasgow, the opportunity that continuous manufacturing affords us in improving our environmental footprint. What I really would like to see happening is an acceleration of adoption of new manufacturing technologies, including continuous manufacturing. So ideally, we want to move this S-curve to the left to get it in a shorter time. The first poll of the day should be appearing in your Slido panel and will allow you to vote, take time to make one vote for one of the options that are showing in that poll, and then we'll use those results as we go through the meeting. The call to action today has a significant impact on patients in exactly the same way as the vaccine has done over the last year. Without continuous manufacturing, Vertex's first cystic fibrosis medicine might never have made it to the market. We also need to build on our assets, and here in the UK, we've already invested in some significant assets. To name only two, the Centre for Continuous Manufacturing and Advanced Crystallization and the Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Centre. We need to build on these existing assets, bringing industry, academics, government and regulators together to drive the uptake of new manufacturing technology and to grow our medicines manufacturing base. Clearly, there needs to be a business case for investment, but that business case needs to go beyond just productivity and quality. So as an example, we should be looking at sustainability and green manufacturing. Continuous manufacturing has already demonstrated an 80% reduction in carbon footprint and a 50% reduction in solvent usage. But beyond that, we have the opportunities that come with speed, flexibility, and resilience in the supply chain. And one thing that we must continue to look towards is a harmonization on equipment and control systems that would really help us with adoption. Intensification, integration, interrogation. I stole this title from Professor Cooney, who we're going to hear from later this afternoon in the final panel session. We need all of these three approaches to drive the success of advanced manufacturing technology. There are already new technologies approaching in continuous manufacturing, and continuous separations would be one of those that we could apply. We've got to continue to engage with vendors to ensure optimal design, but also to push that drive on harmonization. And we have some organizational challenges to consider, in industry in particular. If we're to move to a more distributed supply chain for therapeutics and vaccines in the future, then we need to look at this very carefully. And the final point I want to make before I introduce Lord Bethel is coming back to the application of advanced manufacturing technologies, and particularly continuous manufacturing, to new modalities. Here, I believe that the infrastructure for manufacturing is not so well established, and the case for introducing new technology is much more easily made. I wonder if slightly ahead of schedule, we might be able to switch over to Alistair and Johnathon Marshall.
Hi, thanks, Clive. It's great to be here, and it's my privilege to introduce our second keynote speaker. So as you've already heard, Johnathon Marshall from PwC is giving our next presentation. So Johnathon is a partner at PwC, where he leads the UK Pharma and Life Sciences consulting team. He has over 20 years experience working internationally with companies and businesses across this space. He's currently leading research into the application of digital technologies into pharma manufacturing, a theme I think that Lord Bethel has already introduced into the discussion today, and looking at how the digital technologies can deliver greater agility and ultimately improve customer service. So Jonathan's presentation is going to look at how continuous manufacturing remains relevant, the importance and the opportunities that it affords, and how to position it as an enabler to succeed across the various areas of innovation that are required to realise some of the ambitions and drivers that have already been introduced from Lord Bethel's presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Johnathon for his presentation.
Hi, thank you very much, Alistair, and welcome everybody on the conference today. I guess I was just reflecting there on the quick introduction. I've had the pleasure of working in the pharmaceutical sector now for 20 plus years, I guess. During that time, I've kind of had the pleasure of working across all continents. So, North America, both East and West and Central, Asia Pac, Australasia. I guess I'm looking forward to the various vaccines, treatments and therapies that were accelerating through for COVID, because I've spent 12 months working from this one office at the home. So I'm looking forward to getting out at some point. But hopefully today we can talk through some of the positives that I think we've all got to look forward to as we start to embrace manufacturing techniques and advanced manufacturing techniques, and really how they're going to play a far more relevant and increasingly important role in our industry. One of the things that I want to sort of really pick up is really how do we keep continuous manufacturing relevant and really push the agenda. And Clive, I think, touched on a very important comment at the very beginning, which was accelerating the S curve, so bringing the innovations into sort of mainstream use quicker and in a more prevalent manner. And I think there's a good segue there in terms of Lord Bethel around what does that mean for UK and UK PLC, but also beyond that in terms of what's that mean for the contribution that the pharma life sciences sector makes to society as a whole. So I think that's very important. So what I'm going to try and do over the next 20 minutes or so is really kind of think through what we already know in terms of continuous, how continuous really plays a part in the whole net zero agenda. Clearly a very relevant topic, and an increasingly relevant topic, as we've got COP26 in Glasgow later this year. And it really is becoming an increasing component of every corporate's reporting and ambition and strategy. And then really looking at the economic contribution that it can provide in terms of our sector as a whole. Okay, so I guess in terms of where we are, continuous manufacturing has a great position to play, and really can be looking at how we extend its use across the value chain, also across the product set. We talked earlier on, I think Clive mentioned it in his note, around different modalities and application of continuous to different modalities and different disease treatments. And I think it's really looking out for those areas where we see market growth and market value, where we can start to harness continuous into those portfolios. Monoclonal antibodies is really sort of an area of significant growth. It will continue to grow, and really kind of looking at how continuous can be really engineered into the development pathway of those treatments and therapies. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be starting to look at how we really drive that adoption as part of the early phases of some of the process development work, and as we start to look at the appropriate scale and manufacturing scale as those markets those products are really brought through to market, and really making sure we're sort of harnessing those. Clearly, we've seen a lot of work around vaccines. The past 12 months, I think, has been a phenomenal period for the vaccines development in terms of getting it on the radar. And I think really looking at ways we can sort of bring additional agility to production to ensure we've got scalability in market, in country, is going to be really, really important. And really is a factor of resolving some of the current sort of pandemic challenges that we have today and that we experience today. When we look at the value of vaccines, I think it's really also important in terms of the investment profile that we've probably seen with vaccines. I think it's probably a treatment area where it hasn't attracted the same level of investment across the pharma life sciences segment as traditional treatments. Part of that is clearly if you're treating chronic illness, you've got a patient for life. With the vaccine, you're providing curative treatment, and really making sure the economics of that stack up. But I think really what we see is how can we bring a manufacturing platform and a manufacturing method that really allows us to bring agility to the volumes and the variants that we need to produce in the locations we want to produce in. Clearly, we've seen through COVID an ability to accelerate. We clearly have had some product profiles that are challenging to distribute, others less so. But I think really getting the manufacturing teams in the heart of the development process early is really a key component. And with that comes the benefit of really driving through a more preferable cost line in terms of the manufacturing of some of those products as we move forward. I think the other area I'd like to really touch on is the whole environmental agenda, and how continuous really plays a really key and important part within that. I think we have some use cases. We don't have enough, to be honest, but continuous can, and some of the benchmark analysis that has been completed, and some of the work that we did with CMAC and the members earlier or later last year around the business case for continuous, you really can start to drive a significant reduction in carbon footprint, upwards of 80%, which is material. And I think we've seen some genuine stats from one of the sites that Amgen opened a couple of years back in 2014 around the contribution that design and the way that their site operated really provided benefit in terms of, just in terms of energy consumption and water consumption. And as we start to see sort of raw materials under greater pressure, we've really got to, as an industry, start to play our part in terms of safeguarding that. I think as we start to look as well around the valuation of the sector, it's not something I've sort of pulled out explicitly here in the information, but If you look at the ESG line, so that's the environmental, social, and governance component of an organization, we are starting to see a lot more scrutiny across all manufacturers, all pharmacos, and actually all players in industry on that aspect. And interestingly, some research we have done has demonstrated those organizations that are really driving that agenda are actually benefiting multiples on their valuations. So we're now starting to see how a real passion to drive the environmental story for your organization is hitting the valuation, balance sheet, and other financial metrics. But I think it's also important to think about the value of continuous in terms of the product itself, and also ultimately patients that we are servicing. And there was a report done, actually, it's going back a little bit now, in 2006, so leveraging some old data, but I think it's still relevant today, because you could argue not a lot has changed in terms of fundamental shifts in that S-curve, as Clive would have noted. But we can sort of extrapolate that about 50 billion of value is lost each year through inconsistency and quality issues around API manufacturing. And when you look at that in terms of continuous manufacturing, we can bring in a platform that drives, sort of increase in purity of the API as well as reducing waste. That's a really big dollar value that we can start to unpick and deliver back into development and back into skills development, new sites, new products, new treatments, for example. If you then shift that into secondary, we've talked about energy efficiency. Absolutely, we can start to be far more appropriate in scale for the volume that we want to manufacture to. But also, as you move yourself away from sort of defined batch process where you will always get a certain volume coming out, you can start to be far more attuned to the volumes you need to make, and therefore dropping waste as you manage the process and the consistency of that. And really bringing in, at the heart of continuous, is really bringing in your process analytical technologies to bring that control, and therefore your ability to genuinely understand the reaction that's occurring and control that through the process, and therefore drive efficiency out of it. When you start to look at the economic contribution, and pharma, I think, has over the past year, I think it's been very clear that I think we've always been, as an industry, recognized for the fact we provide phenomenal treatments to society, but I think sometimes our role in society has not always been valued as critically as it has been over the past 12 months, where when you look at every single player in the pharma life sciences segment have all been contributing to ensuring we have some really genuine great treatments for addressing the pandemic at the current time. And clearly that's setting a basis for us to come out of the pandemic and start to drive economic growth more broadly as economies and as countries. But I think it's also worth looking at some of the more UK-focused components of that. And I think one of the things that we can start to look at, and clearly the UK has been through a period of instability. Not only did we have the pandemic as everyone else has had around the world, we've also been repositioning ourselves in response to Brexit and our relationship with Europe and our relationship with the rest of the world. And I really think there is opportunity for us, and there's a couple of quotes here that we've sort of sourced from the media and the press, and some of the names I'm sure are known to folk on the sort of conference today. But I think there's really an opportunity for us to actually understand how can we use the fundamentals of continuous manufacturing and other advanced manufacturing techniques to really bring that consistency to what we make. That really brings that sort of ability to put manufacturing in market, in country, close to patient, that gives us the ability to give supply resilience and control, that gives everyone confidence that when treatments are needed, when therapies are needed, that they will be available at point of use. And I think that's really important for us as we start looking at the different technologies that are available to us. Continuous manufacturing is one, and clearly that's a big topic for us today. But really the other sort of advanced manufacturing sort of concepts that are out there, and how we accelerate them into more genuine and more frequent use across the value chain. And I think this is where we've got a really big opportunity as UK PLC as an industry group, an industry forum. So bringing together the grand challenges and the programs that are under the remit of the ISCMP, MMIC, MMIP, etc. Really driving those investments and analysis to make sort of the UK manufacturing base far stronger, both in terms of provision of product into the patients and our population, but also accelerating and growing the talent base and the footprint that we operate within the UK. I think some of the analysis that we looked at a couple of years ago, when you look at the gross value add of the pharmaceutical industry, we are a major contributor to the UK economy, and I think getting that inward investment that Lord Bethel was talking about is really important for us. Now, to do that, there are some things that we need to work on. Clearly, we heard a little bit on what government can do to this, really around financial incentives and some of the government support through policymakers. I think there are already many vehicles that are available to us. Maybe we don't use them as well as we can. There's a whole bunch of R&D tax credits, which there's some that you'd link into the patent box type structure. But there are others around when you invent new innovations around technology or software or other ways of running a process, can also come under the observations of R&D tax credits. I think also when you start to look at sort of factories and factory production, really getting into that micro scale factories where we can get cost point down. And I think this is going to be critical for us as we look at coming out of the pandemic. I think the government wallet for funding healthcare is going to come under challenge, and therefore our ability to, as an industry, address the cost of goods line of some of our more established products, so some of our generics and others, where we can get the price point down by bringing in far more controllable and an efficient manufacturing process, is really a way that we can take some of the pressure off the drug budgets for government for payers. And I think that's going to be critical as we want to make sure we have funding available for some of the more expensive but really innovative sort of treatments that we are seeking to address many sort of unmet medical needs currently. I think you also then look at the investment in upskilling. I think the questions earlier on in terms of the poll that Clive put out there. I think one of the things we've got to do is really harness the talent that we've got within this country, and I think upskilling that and bringing the education into that cohort of individuals is really important to drive the pharmaceutical manufacturing base in the UK. I think traditionally, we've had some incredible science that we've developed in this country, both from R&D in terms of product development, the clinical efficacy and the impact it has on patient and disease. We've also had some massive innovations around making and manufacturing products, but I think it's how do we harness that within our economy so we can really provide really strong careers for the talent that we want to retain within this country. I was going to go to a Q&A session, but I'm not sure how this is going to work with the technology we've got available today. So I was actually going to spin it around and do a Q&A inverse. So effectively ask the audience more questions than necessarily the audience asking me questions. But it'd be good to get a sense from the audience around a couple of threads, because I think a lot of this is what we'll be debating over the next couple of hours. Is really the role of continuous and how it plays a part. And so really wanted to pose a couple of questions really in terms of where do we see the best application of continuous in the future, and what do we think that should look like as we move forward. Are we driving more cost agenda and making sure we are managing to that? Is that the benefit, or are we really looking at supply chain resilience and making sure we've got that nailed? So I don't know if there's any questions from the floor that might want to explore on this topic a little bit further, and then I'll pose the next question.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we do have a question in.
Excellent.
What changes to the supply chain for medicines do you see in the future, and does this encourage the use of continuous manufacturing and digital technologies?
Yeah, well, I think we do have to recognise that we have new treatments, new therapies coming down the pipe, and the population groups for those treatments and therapies are becoming smaller. So instead of a small molecule for mass treatment, where it might work with 30 or 40% of the people who take it, we're becoming far more attuned in terms of the specific genetic makeup where a product will be efficacious for them. And therefore, that smaller volume, more tailored, really does lend itself perfectly to the world of continuous and smaller manufacturing sort of batches or volume, if you want to put it that way. So I think when you look at treatment types as we get into precision medicine sort of agenda, it does push us into the continuous. And the only way really to drive the precision medicine agenda in a genuine way is having the agility on the manufacturing end as well. And so when you look at the sort of portfolio of products coming down, that will accelerate adoption. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as we're working with our colleagues and with industry players, is looking for opportunity early in development cycles to bring the continuous agenda into the debate and to challenge the way we make products. Because I think it's much easier and safer to say, well, this is how I've always made it. I cannot understand the mechanic and the chemistry in the process. I'll just repeat it because it's safer. But I think we need to challenge that more.
Well, that's great. And I think the consistent themes around there's more to do. I guess, the pace of change, I think, is one of the key underpinning factors in many of the sessions we've had around the ISCMP group, for example. I wonder, what do you see as being the incentives that can be put in place that really will help to accelerate the uptake of innovation in pharmaceutical manufacturing? We've heard around a number of the investments in innovation centres and so on, but the pace of change, is there an opportunity to accelerate that?
I think Alistair, you sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of acceleration. One of the things that we've reflected on as a firm, as PwC, and also with many of our clients, both within the pharma life sciences sector, but also outside, that working through the past 12 months of the pandemic has really accelerated a lot of change in many areas. The most visible we've seen is probably the retail sort of high street sort of challenges. But actually, what it's done is it's created a clarity that is industry and players within the industry need to change quicker, and the digital tools and technologies that we have available really can change the way we operate and the way we work. You then factor in a whole bunch of the broader sort of environmental, social, and governance type programs and needs. We do need to get, I think it was Bill Gates who was talking, that the environmental challenge is probably far greater than the pandemic has been in terms of solving. So you look at these really massive sort of macroeconomic challenges we've got to work through, and therefore we've all got to actually take a bit of a step change in the way we're responding to it. And that's going to mean we're going to take a little bit more risk and a little bit more innovation to a lot of what we do. We can't just do the same old. And I think that philosophy we're seeing through a lot of corporates. And I think we've really got to respond to that within our industry and say, how can we apply new technologies, new techniques in a far more holistic way to the portfolio of products we're making. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be quite passionate about how we drive that forward.
And if I can maybe put you on the spot then, if you had one wish you could implement, and influence government policy, what would the most important incentive you think be that could actually allow that passion for sustainability and innovation to be realised, to support and enable the business cases?
Yep. I'm glad you took a bit of time to ask the question, because it gave me some breathing space to think through an answer. The one wish, I have my kids that keep asking me that question all the time. It tends to be unlimited broadband speed. But what would my one wish be? I think some of it is providing clear incentives to step away from traditional manufacturing. We do have a lot of classic stainless steel manufacturing capability in our economy. And that is still very value adding to us in terms of traditional small molecule batch synthesis. And I think providing investment and investment funds to take some of that out of our language and really promote novel manufacturing earlier in development cycles, whether that's through additional tax credits, R&D breaks for process, maybe holding more of the IP around the process than the molecule. I think there are a couple of threads on that, but I think we've really got to kick ourselves away from big chemical synthesis, consuming huge amounts of energy with massive amount of water, and really get ourselves into more of a sustainable, continuous agenda, I think would be important. And the policy and the investment around that to support it.
That's great, Jonathan. Thanks. And another question from the audience, just highlighting your vaccines have focused an interest, on continuous manufacturing, but looking more broadly at the injectable, and parenteral medicines space across a whole wide range of different indications. Is there enough focus in that space around parenteral sterile manufacture for other applications?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I sort of pointed out at the beginning of the slides, we've done a lot of work around traditional small molecule, because probably you could argue we understand the chemistry and the reactions that make that molecule possible to make, and biologics are always a little bit quirkier to manufacture and a little bit less scientific and a little bit more sort of challenging to put the controls around. But I think we've really got to get some more energy around that. I remember many years ago I used to work for a West Coast-based biofarm, and every 1 in 3 batches of the product we get particulates, and it was kind of, well, it's one of those things, we just live with it. We'd ditch that batch and we'd make another one, and we didn't try and work out why. And clearly, if you want to go down a continuous route, you've got to get to the heart of the reaction and how things are operating, so you can use the controls to volume up, to scale up and scale down. And I think we've really got to put more energy into that. Clearly traditional reactor-based biologic manufacturing is something we kind of understand. Putting that into continuous, I think we need more research into that. But it is a market we've got to get into, and with a lot more focus, a lot more diligence.
Thanks. So, again, more work to do. You mentioned and touched on the onshoring agenda and opportunity and increasing the sort of amount of national manufacturing. Just wonder if you see the focus on that. Again, this is another question from the audience. If you see the focus on that around drug product manufacture, or both drug substance and drug product.
Yeah, it's a topic I think we've got to be really careful on how we sort of address, if I'm honest. And I'm going to talk about both components at the same time on this one. In that the supply chains that have been engineered by many of the pharmacos, big, small biotechs, etc., they've been structured around efficiencies on a global scale, and sort of knee-jerk reactions that we started seeing coming out of the initial starts of the pandemic around localized supply issues. I think we've got to be quite careful about policy that addresses the remediation of that. We have seen various jurisdictions in the globe who've provided quite interesting regulatory and policy structures that promote manufacturing within market, and you end up, if you're not careful, with a very isolated sort of manufacturing network where you just put a factory in Indonesia or one in Russia or one in Brazil because you have to get access to the market. And I think we've got to make sure we don't do reshoring on a defensive play for economy, but we do it for the right reasons. And I think for me, it's around, as we move to more precision medicines with smaller volume for smaller patient cohorts, actually working on the basis of what's the right manufacturing technology to service that patient population better, as opposed to driving in government policy around protectionism, because I don't think that would be good for the industry as a whole. I think it's around the right manufacturing footprint. Now, clearly, I'm not a politician, but I'm sure they have different views on this, and thankfully, I'm not up for re-election or anything at the moment. But I do think we need to look at this as a broader global supply chain structure, as opposed to potentially what we could be seen as defensive for the local economy.
Thanks. I guess just maybe following up on the supply chain aspect, we've heard a lot, around the impacts of COVID, the disruption that it's had. I mean, in terms of the time scales to implement change and innovate in supply versus the time to recover back to what you did before, is there an opportunity at the moment in terms of learning from the changes that have happened during the pandemic around the supply chain and network configurations that we're using? or is that maybe a bit of an optimistic view?
No, I think there's a huge amount of learning we can take. If you look at the collaboration around the vaccines development, various organisations had different bets in terms of the route ways to go down, and I think we need to see far more collaboration to accelerate treatment development. And I think some of the academic links with Oxford, AstraZeneca, I think was a good exemplar. Pfizer really jumping in with BioNTech around their sort of platform. I think that's really generated a recognition that collaboration and almost the open source world that I know many years ago we talked about in terms of accelerating drug development is actually can provide value. I think you then look at the speed with which we've managed to get product into market. And clearly there's been a lot of focus, a lot of funding, a lot of government support around matters. But I think it has started to show how really timely interventions with the regulators observing, looking, and considering data has allowed us to accelerate the regulatory pathway for many of the vaccines. I think that's something we've really got to learn from and continue to embrace. The physical distribution chain, if you look at, actually interestingly, if you look at Pfizer's portfolio, I'm sure there's people on the session over the next couple of days who will know Pfizer's portfolio better than I do, but a lot of the new treatments they're bringing through, do require a very challenging, sort of refrigerated distribution network, in the -80 region. So actually for them, it's quite handy having had the opportunity to build the structures for their vaccine. But I think some of the track and trace capabilities that they've engineered into their supply chain is really important. So I think there are some really good nuances here. You've got collaborations in South Africa around manufacturing of vaccines that are sponsored by the pharmacos. I think we're seeing the best of the industry come out, and I think it's how do we harness some of those little nuggets and take into our sort of post-COVID world, I think will be very important. Economically, how do we manage it? I think that will be more of a challenge, if I'm brutally honest. I think there's a huge amount of recovery that economies have got to sort of get themselves sorted. If you look at the amount of cash we're injecting into, keeping our economy in the UK afloat versus what's going on in the US and other territories, I think there will be some recovery period needed. But whilst we're doing that, now's the time to do something different. And that is, I think, driving a more agile manufacturing footprint, which is a more lower cost and a more agile method.
You mentioned in terms of some of the opportunities, the platforms to help drive the transformation, in terms of financial incentives, the skills agenda, and also the technology agenda, the sort of micro scale factories, aspect. I guess maybe just rolling up a couple of questions that have come in terms of, the recent challenge of scaling out vaccine manufacture. Are the benefits of flow manufacturing in terms of the opportunities to quickly adapt to those flexes of scale, do you think well enough recognised? Is that clear, do you think? And I guess just following on from that, perhaps, do you think we're going to see more distributed manufacturing? And what are the implications for the existing, and established infrastructure?
Yeah, I think, Alistair, it comes back to my comment earlier on around incentives from government. We do have around the world a whole bunch of stainless steel reactors that are pumping small molecules out. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need those still, but we do in terms of certain drug classes where that's the proven way and the most cost efficient way of making. But we shouldn't always look for opportunity to force every other molecule down that pathway. And I think for me, really looking at the business case to adopt advanced manufacturing techniques has to become part of the stage gates that you go through in the development pathway, rather than just, as I said earlier, taking the easy option, which is a method of making that I understand now. It's low risk. We've got skills in house who can do this. Let me go outside and let me push the envelope and look at flow techniques to manufacture product. And I think you've also got an advantage here. And I guess and I'm not a biochemist or a chemical engineer or anything of that nature, but I think one of the things that will be interesting is, given the agility that Continuous brings in terms of, sort of understanding the reaction and the chemistry of what's occurring in the reactor vessel, our ability to tweak and modify, I think particularly in relation to some of the vaccines manufacturing, really allows us to have a bit more control to maybe accelerate the variants that we need to have in our armory as we start to manage, COVID version 2, version 3, version 4 over the coming decades. So I think bringing that flexibility into the manufacturing method, I think will really help the R&D side in terms of bringing those new products to market a little bit quicker.
No, I think that theme in terms of the closer, I guess, the shorter timelines between development and into clinical and commercial supply is a key driver. And maybe just to follow up on one of those themes in terms of the skills agenda. So a question here around, how to help process development scientists better understand the value of employing digital strategies at an early stage in terms of building the knowledge base. I don't know whether you see how different organisations might be implementing their digitalisation agenda and the upskilling component of that. Is there good learning out there to reflect on?
There is, and I always find it interesting that at the moment digital is put in front of everything, and it's the holy grail that's going to solve the world. Sadly, I'm a little bit too old, and I remember when was putting everything, the e-commerce and everything else was in front of everything. So I think it's not the holy grail, but it's actually fluency of what the assets are that are out there and how we apply them. It's understanding how can we bring some of the proven smaller tech, so whether that's augmented reality or similar sort of techniques to allow us to do remote training, validation of equipment. Can we apply those differently in terms of how we commission facilities and commission sites? Is there other things we can do around some of the computer simulation, computer modeling? Gamification. I look at some of the games that my kids play, and it's almost the real world. And how do we bring more of that digital twin type environment into our lexicon? So it's not just a little bit of a side of desk project that we play with. It's actually the way we develop the manufacturing process, full stop. Boeing many years ago sort of moved to fully online sort of design of I think it was the 777 was the first one they went that way. Really bringing the best of the brains from the world to collaborate on the design of an aircraft. How do we do that in pharma in a pure digital environment? Clearly, we've got to have comfort in the models and the simulation and the tools, and I think that's where a combination of academia and an industry can play a great part. But it may not be just the industry from within pharma life sciences. We may have to look outside into other areas of our environment to get inspiration of what tools to play with. I think it's the old adage of you don't know what you don't know sometimes, and I think it's asking others what they're using and how they're playing with new assets will be really important. So I think there's more to do. There's every time I look on the journals and the magazines, there's new techniques, there's new ideas, there's new principles and new philosophies. It's really hard to keep up, and I think it's how do we really hone in on some of those thoughts and bring it into our manufacturing ways.
I think it's interesting looking at some of the early polls, and responses. I think the importance and value of collaboration, sharing case studies across the community, I think just comes strongly again. Now, Jonathan, I appreciate you're getting quite a grilling here. The first session obviously ran a little bit shorter than anticipated because of some of our challenges. So I hope you're okay for another couple of minutes. I know you had at the end of the session a reverse Q&A. You were trying to put the onus on the audience. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to highlight, but I've got more questions here from the audience to go through.
I was going to ask Lord Bethel around digital poverty and clearly the need for fibre optic broadband to every corner of the UK is a minimum, but unfortunately his signal dropped before I could ask the question.
Infrastructure being always an important aspect for innovation. I guess maybe an interesting question around, what do you think needs to change for the pharmaceutical industry to see manufacturing as a core, element of the arsenal to overall competitiveness? is manufacturing, a real driver for innovation? Is that part of the reason, I guess, the pace is maybe not as fast as you might anticipate?
I think I think that perspective is definitely changing and changing quickly. I can remember we as PwC we put a paper out in 2007, 8, or 9, I think it was, where we did a supply chain 2020 vision, and now we're here, and we did comment that supply chain needed to be the source of strategic advantage, that it needed to be the capability that was ensuring medicines, treatments, therapies were made available to clinicians to make available to patients in the most efficient way. And actually, we sort of had a few conversations around it, and the consensus was that supply chain was that necessary evil. It was something you got to have, got to make it, I've got to be able to move it, I've got to get it into a warehouse, and it's got to be available in a safe way for a patient. And actually, we only get a pat on the back when it's working and it's never hitting the radar. As soon as anything happens, we're the worst thing since sliced bread. So, it was one of those that you kept off the radar. And I think what we're starting to see, and we're seeing this increasingly so, when you look at some of the advanced treatments and therapies that are coming down the patch, the only way you can provide those is by having real agility in your manufacturing, real agility in your supply chain. You've got some treatments and therapies, sort of cell therapies at the moment, where I've got to extract cell, manipulate, within 30 days, have it back to the patient to readmit to ensure I get the efficacy out. Now, I can't run that on an Excel spreadsheet, on the back of my sort of iPad. You've got to have true integration of systems with the patient, with the clinicians, with practice nurse, whoever else is doing the administration, or etc., to choreograph the actual treatment, and that needs true supply chain control. This is not about big batch into a warehouse, hold it for months, and I have a year and a half's worth of stock. That's not going to work. And I think that is really shifting the pivot towards supply chain being the critical differentiator. The debate about vaccines that we can have, I think it'll be a really good use case in 3 or 4 years' time when we look back on this. The big challenge here was not necessarily developing the vaccine, but actually, can we scale it? Can we make it available? And can we distribute it so it's still intact at point of injection? And some of these have got quite complex temperature needs and sensitivity needs. And I think that has really, again, sort of promoted supply chain as really the sort of essence of what we've got to have in place. I'm quite evangelical about this, but I guess I've had too many years where I've heard the R&D organizations say we're really, really super important. If we don't develop a drug, then we're pointless. I've got commercial teams saying, well, if we don't sell anything, we don't make any money, therefore we're pointless. But actually, if I can't actually take the R&D and make it and scale it, then there's nothing for the commercial guys to sell. So I think we've really got to be really passionate about the pivotal role we play in that value chain.
Well, Jonathan, look, I think that brings us to the end of the time. I think that's some really fantastic insights and perspectives, that helps frame, I think, some of the following discussions that we're going to have. There were many more questions you'll come through, so apologies to those. We weren't able to get through them all, but as Clive said, we will look to follow up with those as part of the final reporting. The poll is now live, so I'd encourage everyone to go on and the opportunity to add comments and highlight any additional points you'd like to make on the topics Jonathan's covered there. But thanks again, Jonathan.